Hi, I'm Gretchen Andrew, and I'm here with my dear friend Lindsay Thompson, and I'm doing a conversation series as part of my residency with Gazelle Art House at gazelle.io with women who are artists, technologists, and are using their work um, through the decisions they make and the way that they move throughout the world to be creating a world that is more their own, and therefore my thesis behind this, inherently more feminist. And Lindsay falls into both of those categories, being an animator and an artist, and obviously animation having a lot to do with technology and being a very perceived to be very male dominated industry and male dominated user group. And I'm really excited to hear more about what Lindsay does for work, having spent so much time with her socially. She works for an animation house that makes the Spider-Man game, probably most famously, and which is now part of Sony. Congratulations on that, by the way. So I just wanted to start to hear more about what you do and also your journey to getting to animation. I know you went to Otis for art school, and yeah, just like the way you like to tell this.
My journey.
Yes, please. Not
Well,
just for me, but for everybody else.
sure. Yeah. I kind of stumbled into animation. I guess growing up, I was always interested in creative pursuits. Like I studied guitar for 6 years intensely, and then I went to art school and I never picked a guitar up again. But I just knew as I was heading out of high school that I wanted to do something creative with my life or interesting, or not that, I mean, everything isn't, we're whatever. I just knew normal college wasn't going to be suited for me. So I went to art school, but without really much of an art background. And once I got there, I had big plans to go into fashion design. I was like doing lots of sketches of clothes, and in high school, I was always ripping things up and putting them back together. But when I got to the actual reality of fashion school, I realized pretty quickly it wasn't for me because it was a little bit of a cutthroat kind of industry. And when I was in my first year, I met all the, and I say guys because it was a lot of guys that were going into digital media, and they were all just hanging out and like talking about movies. And I was like, I just want to hang out with them. I don't want to be in this other industry. So I, on a whim, signed up for digital media as my major without even having used computers very much. So I went in and we only had 2 animation classes for the whole 4 years I was there, and I just took them over and over again. And like my first animation class, it was kind of one of those revelations of like, oh my gosh, this is how something moves. And doing that on a computer for the first time, where I literally set a keyframe of like a circle just going from A to B and hitting play and seeing it move, I was like, it just conceptually, like the idea of how it's done hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was really excited about it. So I just started taking the animation classes over and over again. And any class I had that wasn't animation related, I would just turn it into an animation project. And I got my head of our department to allow me to do independent studies. I just got really passionate about it, and filmmaking was always interesting to me. So it was kind of a natural fit, and it was performance, which when I was a kid, I was like, I'm going to be an actress. I took acting classes, all this stuff that I kind of subconsciously didn't think about ended up leading me towards animation. And I got, I worked really hard, but I got very lucky. I met the right person right as I was about to graduate, and I got my demo reel to the right person, and I got hired to work in films straight out of school when I was 21, and I'm 34 now. And it took me around the world. So I got to go work on movies, and I lived in New Zealand and Australia, and I lived in Canada. I was up in the Bay Area for a while, and then I luckily got to come home, I grew up in Los Angeles, so my family's here, and I got a job at Insomniac Games, which I've been there for the last 7 years, and it's awesome. And our studio in particular is really awesome. It's very, in the video game industry, it's incredibly diverse, and they're very, it's on the front of mind at all times at our studio. Our leadership is always trying to improve that. And since I've been there in 7 years, the studio has changed so much. There's so many more different types of people. Video games has typically been like a white male industry, and we've got all colors, we've got all sexual orientations, we've got women, we've got men, we've got non-gender conforming, we've got transgender employees, and having all those voices at our studio now is contributing to better and better products because we're having all the voices contribute. So my studio is so amazing, and I feel really lucky.
That's interesting. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about like the maybe the perception of, oh, like video games are played by this particular demographic, and then also from what I've understand, like the research actually shows that people who play video games are much more diverse than maybe the market had thought of itself. Can you talk a little bit about just the perception of who the consumer is versus who it actually ends up being?
Yeah, I think what some of the biggest issues were in games for a long time were that the creators were not very diverse. So when you have a room full of one type of person, they're really not asking the questions that should be asked or suggesting the ideas that should be suggested. So as these games are continually getting made that are maybe catering to one group of people, I think, you know, as times have changed, there's been more of a public outcry or conversation about the types of things we want to play. And then also people, there was a woman who, she was the main designer on this series called Uncharted. And they're some of my favorite games. It's basically like Indiana Jones if it were a video game. It's really fun. It's action adventure. It's funny. It's, you know, it's got a male lead and all this, but she was the main producer on it, and she basically said, when we decided not to make games for a demographic, it opened up like the entire world of the game. They weren't catering towards anybody. They didn't decide to make this as a guy game or a girl game or whatever, and they found that everybody loved it. And it was just, I think right now, you know, representation is becoming so important, and more we're seeing female leads in games, people of color as leads in games, and our company is always striving to make sure that we have our diversity showing in the games, so that people relate to it. And that's what's cool about, you know, Spider-Man is we've really pushed more and more to have representation in those games, even though the lead is a white male character. But there is a whole, you know, Spider Universe. We, you know, there's all kinds of characters in that. But I just think things are changing now that we have different people at the table. Because my first game that I worked on at Insomniac, it was called Sunset Overdrive, and it's definitely kind of a crude, funny, cheeky type of game. But I remember at a certain point, you know, there may be some off-color humor, but the head of our studio came to my desk and was like, "Hey, you know, we don't have a ton of women here. Can you tell me if there's anything in the game that makes you feel uncomfortable?" And I was like, "Well, there wasn't a ton, but I told him my thoughts on certain things, and he's like, okay, awesome." He goes, "We don't want to be the people making those kind of games. We don't want to put that out in the world, so we're going to try to change that up." And they did, and it just made me feel so good, and it made me want to be more involved in the video game community, because I wasn't always super involved in video games, but I work in them, and I could say that there were reasons of it felt like, you know, they were catering to a certain group of people, and as it's becoming more inclusive, it makes more people want to be involved, and it makes more people want to be working on the games, and it's telling little girls that they can come work on games, and it's telling, you know, all kinds of people that we're not we don't want to, there's a word that I'm forgetting that I can't think of. I think the creators and the leadership is important to changing the entire industry. It's just, and it's, in the 7 years I've been in it, it has so rapidly changed, and it's really exciting to see all the different things that are coming out now.
It's so cool the way, first of all, the way that you've seen the change in 7 years. But I'm really interested in what you're saying of how when there stopped being this demographic profile for games,
Yes.
designer and artist, and what you like when you make a consumer product versus when you make like art, it seems like not having a demographic profile allowed it to be art more than it was previously allowed to be.
Yeah, it's not, when you don't cater to a certain group, it seems to naturally become more universal and more interesting to more groups of people. I mean, there's something to be said about making something precious and specific, but it's pretty cool that, like, you know, Insomniac up until recently was an independent studio for over 20 years, and we only recently were bought by Sony, which in my opinion was a very positive thing. We've always had a really good relationship with them. But oh gosh, I'm losing my train of thought.
You're doing great.
What was I just saying? Where did I start?
We were talking about just like the losing of the demographic and the way that opens up everything.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's what I was going to say, is that we are owned by Sony now, but we kind of operate like a mom and pop. And I think what people don't realize, you see all these like comments and there are people like, oh, they're, you know, it's corporate and they're trying to ruin our thing, or they don't know about, you know. I think people were really excited to see that Insomniac was making Spider-Man, because we are a little bit of an indie studio, and I think they trusted that we would care about it, and we would care about creatively and artistically and emotionally about the story. And there were days when we were in meetings and we were making decisions and we were, you know, conceptualizing ideas, and it really was just, it's literally a room full of artists who care about this, pitching ideas and making them happen. And it was so cool to me to see what seems like a corporate project. It really wasn't at all. It was very creative, and games have been the most creatively fulfilling thing in my life, in my career.
And I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all, because even like from my standpoint, I mean, you know me and my work really well. And I think about the levels of impact that I can possibly have doing what I do, be crossing into art that is also entertainment, art that is also game, art that is also product. You're just having the lens of what you do and the certain values of not just you as an animator, but the studio that you work for. You're absolutely reaching a much wider demographic and making more cultural impact. It gets really cool to see that it's kind of like very art led in that way.
Yeah, and I think that was that's our, you know, our leadership, our owner, our CEO, Ted Price. I tell everybody what a great leader he is, because he leads by example, and kind of our company motto is basically for the greater good. It's what is how can we have the greatest impact on people's lives, and a good impact on people's lives. And so we're constantly making decisions based off of that. And it's really astounding what good leadership can do for company culture. And, you know, I work in an office right now. We're working from home, which I also really love. But our office culture has always been really fantastic, even though there has been a, you know, majority of men. There's been, you know, you realize that you truly do create a culture by leadership, you know, leading by example. And Ted has never been shy from being outspoken about how people should be treated, and what we want to be as a company, and what we want to do in the world, and what we want to do with this opportunity to work on this, you know, massive entity like Spider-Man. And so he's always been somebody that we really trust. And I think that manifests in the quality of what we do.
Um, and it's interesting. Like actually, one of the things I wanted to speak to you about also is like the leadership in, I guess maybe more of like a social way. Something I've noticed about you, whether we're at LAFC games or like in the community that's around your partner's work, in different groups that we've spent time in. You have your what is it, your murder podcast, real.
Yeah.
I see you very much as someone who bring women together, and I'm wondering, is that something that's intentional to you? Is it something you do at work and through your work as well, or is that something that kind of evolves and it's just like natural over time, or is that something you've thought about as wanting to be part of your life?
I think it is intentional, and it is actually something I do at my work. I do actually, well, up until recently, would host ladies' nights with our female employees, and we would do happy hour. I've been also trying to expand that into like non-binary and women, and basically kind of maybe a little bit more minority groups at our studio to get together. And it's so positive and wonderful because we can even within the studio kind of forget that we're surrounded by so many women. And I've always, I guess once I was 6 or 7 years into my career, I'd say the first 5 or 6 years of my career were only like surrounded by men. When I worked in New Zealand, I was one of 2 women in a department of 45. And I think I didn't even realize until I was alone. I was alone with like 2 women at some point in that job. And I realized I was alone with women for the first time in what had been like years. And I was like, "Ooh, I needed this. Like, I just need to be around some women." And and I think at that point is when I realized how much I needed it in my life, and how much, we've hit such a different point, I think, in this world. I think for so long, women were pitted against each other. And even early in my career, I realized I was kind of a unique entity. And I would feel a little threatened sometimes when there was other women, like, "Oh, I'm the woman in this group," or, something like you just felt that. And then just a full 180 of like, I want all these women to be in this room because our voices and the energy that we bring is so different, and it's such a different sensitivity, and it's so crucial for the art that we make. So I think intentionally seeking out women, making female friends, and trying to support other women has been so important to me in the last like decade of my life.
Something you brought up earlier about like growing up and being interested in acting and this performative thing, and I know that your father worked in television. Can you talk a little bit more about how that impacts the way that you work, either with other people in your company or actually make, your games or your animations day to day?
It's been really, really helpful for my career, and it was something that I think I didn't even immediately recognize when I started being an animator, that how much acting is involved in it. When I try to explain to people what I do, 3D animation, I say, a lot of people say, "Oh, do you draw in the computer?" And I go, "No, I don't. I don't draw anything. I work in 3D, so it's a lot more like puppetry. So it's a lot more of like manipulating a character in 3D through time, and it's creating a performance. And a lot of times we'll shoot our own video reference of performing. So like lately we've been on a lot of Zoom meetings, and I'll be in the meeting trying to explain some notes of a scene I'm working on. And, I'm usually in the camera and I'm performing and acting, and I'm trying to get them to look at me. So that's something that's part of my life always. And then also, funnily enough, when I started at Insomniac, there was so few women. And usually when we pre-visualize some of our scenes, we don't have any sort of final acting or audio from the real actors. So immediately I was kind of pulled out like, "Hey, you're a woman. Would you mind recording some lines of dialogue for us?" And I went in the office to the audio team, and they had a hard time finding a woman who wanted to do it at the studio. And I said, "Yeah, I used to do some acting." And I went in there and just started performing, and they were like, "Oh my gosh." And pretty much I've probably played every female character in every game we've made since I've been there. Initially, they'll usually re-record me, but I did get a couple lines in our first game that I worked on. But yeah, I usually record a lot of our female audio work, and I perform it, and it really helps the animators work on their scenes because you're having an actual performance rather than somebody really dry reading the lines off of the script. So it's actually pretty important to my work.
Yeah, I mean that reminds me a little bit of like thinking about like Shakespeare being performed and male actors playing the women because they didn't allow women to be in
Yeah.
the theater. How different this would be if there wasn't even that physicality of what it feels like to have a female body represented through the characters and in these worlds that you guys create virtually.
Yeah, and I guess it's changing now, but I think the first 5, 8 years of my career, I don't think I ever animated a female character for a long time. And I would always try to shoot my own reference, and I was having the opposite problem where I worked on the Incredible Hulk, and I was trying to shoot reference of myself, like like doing stuff like that, and the anim director was just like, "You just can't use that. Like, it's just not good reference." And I would have to get. We had this guy who was like a bodybuilder at our work, but he wasn't an animator or anything. But he would come out and he would just do everything physically, and we would just shoot him and use his body for reference. So now that we have more female characters, we're definitely able to take more advantage of, no, this is how a woman moves, or it's different, or maybe this character how she would move. So we have a little bit. It's a little nicer to have some women around for that.
Yeah, and how does that feel when you see something that you were physically doing with your body go through the whole process and end up in a game?
It's cool. I mean, it feels, yeah, you feel like you're contributing, and that you were, irreplaceable, and because of who I am. And yeah, it's really fun. I've also gotten to step into like a little, kind of motion suit and do some stuff. So yeah, and then I also have had the opportunity to direct actors, our real actors, in our last game, and getting to work on the mocap stage with the actors. And I think I've always been known for being a very physical director because I'll really get in there and start performing and all that with them. So it's fun. It's really fun.
That's awesome. Well, that's like a little bit of what I knew that I wanted to ask you, and I'm so thankful that we got to do this, both
Yeah.
because I think what you do is really interesting, but then also so much of this project for me is finding these people that I spend time with non-professionally, non-creatively, and getting to hear about you and your passion. And thank you so much for joining me on this one. I'm so thankful.
And I miss you.